Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. The corridor is narrow and it smells of wet stone, the kind of stone that has been underground for so long it has absorbed the dampness into its molecular structure and will never be dry again. Not if you left it in the sun for 100 years. The walls are sweating, moisture beads on surfaces that have not seen daylight since the masons laid them 2 centuries ago. And somewhere ahead, beyond the circle of light thrown by the single torch the guard is carrying, there is a sound. A low rhythmic sound that could be machinery, or could be breathing, or could be something else entirely. Something that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up because your body recognizes it before your mind does. It is the sound of a human being in extreme distress. The year is 1498. The place is Seville in the southern reaches of the Kingdom of Spain. The building is the Castillo de San Jorge, the ancient fortress that serves as the headquarters of the Holy Office of the Inquisition for the district of Andalusia, and the man being led down this corridor is named Diego Alvarez. He is 34 years old. He is a merchant. He sells cloth and leather goods in the markets of Seville, where his family has lived for 3 generations. He has a wife named Isabel and 2 daughters, the eldest 7 and the youngest 4. This morning he kissed them goodbye and told them he would be home by evening. He will not be home by evening. He will not be home for a very long time. Because last week a neighbor told the Inquisition that Diego's family lights candles on Friday evenings, that his wife buys her meat from a particular butcher, that his household does not eat pork. These are small things, ordinary domestic habits that Diego never thought twice about because they were simply the way his mother did things and her mother before her. But to the officers of the Holy Inquisition, they are evidence that Diego Alvarez, a baptized Christian whose grandparents converted from Judaism 50 years ago, is secretly practicing the faith of his ancestors. He is, in the language of the Inquisition, a Judaizer, a heretic, an enemy of Christ, hiding behind the mask of Christian baptism. The neighbor who reported him is a man Diego has known for years, a man whose children play with Diego's children. A man who borrowed money from Diego last winter and has not repaid it. Whether the accusation was motivated by genuine religious conviction or by the knowledge that a convicted heretic's property was seized by the Inquisition, eliminating both the debt and the debtor in a single act of piety, Diego will never know. The Inquisition does not reveal the identity of accusers. Diego has been told nothing about why he is here. He has been given no formal charge. He has seen no accuser and been shown no evidence. He has simply been taken from the street by officers of the Holy Office, brought to this fortress, and led underground to a place where the torches burn low, and the sounds from behind closed doors make his hands shake so badly he has to clench them into fists to keep the guard from noticing. The guard stops at a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. He opens it, and Diego sees for the first time in his life the interior of an Inquisition torture chamber. The room is perhaps 20 feet square. The ceiling is low, the stone arched, the air thick with a smell that is part sweat and part blood and part something chemical he cannot identify. Along the walls, mounted on brackets and hung from hooks, are devices he has never seen before, but whose purpose he understands instinctively the way a rabbit understands a trap. Wooden frames with ropes, metal implements with sharp edges, pulleys bolted to the ceiling with chains hanging from them, a long wooden table fitted with rollers at each end. And in the center of the room, a man in the black robes of a Dominican friar standing beside a man in a leather apron, whose hands are the largest Diego has ever seen. The friar speaks. His voice is calm and measured, almost kind. He tells Diego that the Holy Office desires only the truth, that if Diego confesses freely and names any others who practice Jewish rites in secret, this interview will be brief, and the punishment merciful, that the instruments arranged around this room are instruments of salvation, designed to free the soul from the grip of heresy through the purification of physical suffering, that the Church loves Diego and wishes only to save him. Diego says he has nothing to confess. He says he is a faithful Christian. He says his family lights candles because the evenings are dark and they do not eat pork because it disagrees with his wife's digestion. The friar nods. He turns to the man in the leather apron, and what happens next in this room over the course of the next several hours involves a progression of methods so carefully designed and so systematically applied that each one builds on the one before it, escalating from discomfort to agony, to a level of suffering that the human body was never meant to experience. The Spanish Inquisition did not invent torture, but it refined it into something that was closer to a science than a brutality. A carefully documented, officially sanctioned physician-supervised system of destroying the human body in precisely calibrated increments designed to extract confession without quite killing the subject, at least not immediately. Here at Crimson Legacy Historians, I'm going to walk you through 8 of the most horrific torture methods used by the Spanish Inquisition, and I'm going to describe them in the order that they were typically applied, from the least severe to the most devastating, because that escalation pattern was itself part of the design. The Inquisition understood that showing a prisoner what was coming next was almost as effective as doing it. Each method was worse than the last. Each one made the prisoner think that what they had already endured was nothing compared to what was about to happen. And they were right. Make sure to subscribe to Crimson Legacy Historians and watch this entire video, because by the time I reach the final method on this list, you will understand why the Spanish Inquisition remains 500 years later a synonym for the absolute worst that human beings can do to each other in the name of God. Method 1. The San Benito, public humiliation. The first method was designed to break the spirit before a single instrument touched the body. It was called the San Benito, and it was a form of public humiliation so devastating that many victims considered it worse than physical pain. The accused was forced to wear a garment resembling a yellow tunic, often decorated with painted flames and demons, and was paraded through the streets of their city in a public procession called an auto de fe. The entire population was required to attend. Friends, neighbors, business associates, customers, everyone the accused had ever known was gathered to watch them march in shame through streets they had walked 1,000 times before. The San Benito identified the wearer as a condemned heretic. It destroyed their reputation, their business, their social standing, their children's future marriage prospects, everything they had built over a lifetime. And the garment did not go away after the procession. It was hung in the local church with the wearer's name inscribed on it, where it would remain for generations, marking the family as tainted by heresy long after the original accused was dead. This was not torture in the conventional sense. No bones were broken, no blood was drawn. But the Inquisition understood something fundamental about human psychology. That identity destruction can be more agonizing than physical destruction. That watching your neighbors look at you with disgust, watching your children hide their faces, watching everything you built crumble because of a yellow shirt was a form of suffering that reached places no instrument could touch. But the San Benito was only the beginning. Method 2. Flogging. For those who did not confess during or after their public humiliation, the physical methods began, and the first of these was something the Inquisition applied so routinely that it barely registered as torture in the official records: flogging. The prisoner was stripped to the waist and bound to a post or a frame. A torturer administered blows with a leather whip or a bundle of rods, typically across the back, the shoulders, and the buttocks. The number of strokes was prescribed by the inquisitor and could range from a few dozen to several hundred. The pain was immediate and intense. The skin split open after the first few strokes, and within minutes, the back was a raw surface of torn flesh and exposed muscle. But flogging was considered mild by Inquisition standards. It was the baseline, the warm-up, the thing they did to show the prisoner what even the lightest punishment felt like, so that the prisoner could imagine what the heavier ones would involve. Many prisoners confessed during or immediately after flogging, not because the pain was unbearable, but because they understood, intuitively, that this was the least of what awaited them if they continued to resist. Method 3. The heretic's fork. Those who endured the flogging and still refused to confess encountered something far more psychologically devastating: the heretic's fork. This device was deceptively simple: a metal rod with 2 sharp prongs at each end. It was secured around the prisoner's neck with a leather strap. One set of prongs pressed into the soft flesh beneath the chin, the other set pressed into the breastbone. The prisoner was then placed in a standing or sitting position with their hands bound behind them and left there. That was all. No pulling, no stretching, no striking, just 2 sets of sharp metal points pressing into flesh. The genius of the heretic's fork was that it transformed the prisoner's own body into the instrument of torture. If the prisoner's head dropped from exhaustion, the prongs pierced deeper into the throat. If they tried to speak, the movement of the jaw drove the upper prongs into the underside of the chin. If they fell asleep, which the body desperately wanted to do after hours and then days of enforced wakefulness, The involuntary relaxation of the neck muscles would cause the prongs to draw blood and jolt them awake with pain. Many of these devices were engraved with a single Latin word, abjuro. I recant. The prisoner could make it stop at any time simply by saying that word. All they had to do was abandon everything they believed and everything they were, and the prongs would be removed. The heretic's fork did not destroy the body. It destroyed the mind. Sleep deprivation, constant low-level pain, inability to speak or eat or rest, the knowledge that relief was one word away, but that the word would cost them their soul. Modern interrogation researchers recognize the heretic's fork as one of the earliest systematic applications of psychological torture, and its principles are disturbingly similar to techniques documented in far more recent contexts. Method 4, the garrucha, strappado. But the Inquisition did not stop its psychology. For prisoners who withstood the heretic's fork without confessing, the physical destruction began in earnest. And the first major instrument was the garrucha, known in other parts of Europe as the strappado. The prisoners' hands were tied behind their back. A rope was attached to their bound wrists and threaded through a pulley mounted on the ceiling. Then the torturer pulled the rope and the prisoner was lifted off the ground, their entire body weight hanging from their arms, which were twisted behind them at an angle the human shoulder was never designed to sustain. The pain was immediate and catastrophic. The shoulders bearing the full weight of the body in a position of extreme extension began to dislocate within minutes. The prisoner hung suspended, their feet dangling, their arms screaming with a pain that radiated from the shoulders down through every nerve. But the basic strappado was only the first variation. The Inquisition added refinements. The most common was called the drop. The prisoner was hoisted to the ceiling and then released to fall, the rope catching them with a savage jerk just before they hit the ground. The sudden stop multiplied the force on the already damaged shoulders by a factor of 5 or more, tearing ligaments, shredding tendons, and causing dislocations so violent that witnesses reported being able to hear the joints separating from adjacent rooms. Weights were sometimes attached to the prisoner's feet to increase the downward force. Stones weighing 20, 50, sometimes 100 lb, hung from the ankles, turning the body into a living pendulum of agony. The strappado rarely lasted more than an hour because it did not need to. The damage it inflicted in that time was severe enough to leave permanent disability, nerve damage, and chronic pain that lasted a lifetime. Inquisition records from civil document cases where prisoners lost the use of their arms entirely after a single session. The historian Henry Charles Lea, who spent decades studying Inquisition archives, described accounts in which the sounds of joints separating during strappado sessions could be heard by other prisoners in adjacent cells, serving as a form of psychological torture for anyone who knew they might be next. Think about Diego. Think about him hanging from that ceiling with his shoulders slowly pulling apart. Think about him hearing the friar's calm voice below him, asking the same questions over and over. Do you practice Jewish rites? Do you know others who practice Jewish rites? Name them. The pain is beyond anything he has experienced in his life, beyond anything he imagined the human body could feel. And the voice keeps asking, patient and reasonable, as though this were a conversation between colleagues rather than the systematic destruction of a man's body. Method 5, the patro, the rack. You would think the strappado would be enough. You would think that suspending a human being from dislocated shoulders while weights pulled their body apart would satisfy even the Inquisition's appetite for suffering. But you would be wrong, because the next method was worse, considerably worse. The patro was the Inquisition's version of the rack. The prisoner was laid on their back on a wooden frame, and their wrists and ankles were fastened with ropes to rollers at each end. As the rollers turned, the ropes tightened, and the body was pulled in 2 directions simultaneously. The joints separated, the cartilage that cushioned the bones tore apart. The ligaments that held the skeleton together stretched beyond their capacity and snapped. The sound of a body being pulled apart on the patro was something that the Inquisition deliberately used as a weapon. Before a prisoner was placed on the rack, they were often brought to watch someone else being stretched. This was not accidental cruelty. It was procedure. The Inquisition's own manuals recommended showing the instruments of torture to the accused before using them, a practice they called the terridio, because the anticipation of pain was itself a form of persuasion. The sounds alone, the cracking and tearing and the screaming, were enough to produce confessions from witnesses who had not yet been touched. One Inquisition notary recorded that a prisoner standing outside the chamber door confessed to everything he was accused of and several things he was not accused of after hearing what was happening to the man inside. He never saw the rack. He only heard it. That was enough. In the Spanish version, the ropes were also wound tightly around the prisoner's arms and legs and twisted into the flesh, with each turn of the roller, cutting through skin and muscle as the body stretched. Some accounts describe the ropes being wound so tightly that they cut to the bone. One account notes that the practice of tying rope around the prisoner's forehead was eventually abandoned because it was apt to start the eyes from their sockets. The potro was the most common method of torture used by the Spanish Inquisition, employed in more cases than any other single device, and its effectiveness was measured not only in confessions extracted, but in the permanence of the damage it inflicted. Many prisoners who survived the rack never walked normally again. Their joints were permanently damaged, their tendons torn beyond repair, their bodies broken in ways that 16th-century medicine could not fix. Method 6, the toca, waterboarding. But there was another method that the Inquisition considered even more effective than the rack, a method that left no visible marks on the body, that caused no broken bones, that shed no blood, and that was so perfectly designed to simulate the experience of dying that prisoners who endured it often wished the rack had killed them instead. This method was called the toca, and you know it today by its modern name, waterboarding. The prisoner was strapped to a wooden trestle with their head positioned lower than their feet. Sharp cords called cordales were wound tightly around the limbs, biting into the flesh. A thin cloth was forced into the prisoner's mouth and spread across the face. Then water was poured slowly onto the cloth from a clay jar. The cloth absorbed the water and pushed back into the throat, saturating the airway, filling the mouth and nasal passages. The prisoner could not breathe. The body triggered its drowning reflex, the primitive, involuntary panic response that fires when the brain detects water in the airway. The lungs heaved, the diaphragm spasmed, the chest contracted violently, trying to expel water that continued to pour. The prisoner experienced the absolute certainty that they were drowning, that death was seconds away, that the next failed breath would be their last. Then the cloth was removed, and the prisoner was allowed to breathe, to gasp and choke and vomit water. And then the cloth was replaced, and the process began again. Up to 8 quarts of water could be poured during a single session. Prisoners vomited so violently that the acid burned their throats and nasal passages. Some lost consciousness. Some suffered permanent lung damage from water aspiration. And the inquisitors considered this method a model of restraint because it left no marks on the body that a visiting physician could document as evidence of excessive cruelty. Historian Edward Peters, who studied Inquisition records extensively, noted that the toca was treated by inquisitors as routine, as commonplace and unremarkable as a modern cross-examination. They did it to hundreds, possibly thousands of people with the calm efficiency of professionals performing a standard procedure, and they documented every session in meticulous records that survive in Spanish archives to this day. Method 7, the Spanish donkey, wooden horse. Now, if you are thinking that the toca must be the worst of what the Inquisition had to offer, I need to tell you that we have not yet reached the last 2 methods, and these are the ones that push the boundary of what the human imagination is capable of devising. The 7th method was called the Spanish donkey, or the wooden horse. The prisoner was stripped of clothing and placed to straddle a narrow wedge-shaped wooden beam like the spine of a triangular roof. The sharp edge of the wedge pointed upward, and the prisoner's full body weight rested on the most sensitive tissue between their legs. Their hands were bound behind them, their feet hung on either side of the beam, unable to reach the ground, unable to shift their weight, unable to relieve the pressure on flesh and muscle and nerve that was never designed to bear the weight of a human body. Then slowly weights were added to the prisoner's ankles. 5 lb, 10, 20, 50. Each additional pound increased the downward force on the wooden edge, pressing it deeper into tissue, compressing nerves, cutting circulation, causing a pain that prisoners described as indistinguishable from being slowly cut in half. Sessions lasted hours. Some lasted the better part of a day. The damage was severe and in some cases permanent, destroying nerves and tissue in ways that affected the prisoner for the rest of their life. The Spanish donkey was a device of such calculated cruelty that even other torturers considered it excessive. Its purpose was not information extraction. Its purpose was annihilation of resistance. It was the thing the Inquisition used when nothing else had worked, when the prisoner had endured the strappado and the rack and the waterboard, and still refused to confess. The Spanish donkey was the Inquisition's final argument, and it was devastating. Method 8, the auto da fe, public execution. But even the Spanish donkey was not the end, because the ultimate method of the Inquisition was not a torture technique at all. It was an execution, and it was designed to be as public, as prolonged, and as psychologically devastating as possible. The auto da fe, meaning act of faith, was the culmination of the Inquisition's process. The condemned were brought to a public square, where the entire population was gathered by order of the authorities. Nobles sat on elevated platforms. Diplomats were invited as honored guests. Street vendors sold food and drink to spectators, who had arrived early to secure good viewing positions. It was treated as entertainment, as spectacle, as a celebration of the faith's triumph over heresy. The condemned were led through the crowd wearing their sanbenitos, carrying green candles, accompanied by priests who urged them to recant even at this final moment. Those who confess SSD at the stake were granted the mercy of being strangled with a garrote before the fire was lit, dying by suffocation rather than burning. Those who refused were burned alive. The fire was built deliberately with green wood that burned slowly and produced enormous amounts of thick, choking smoke before the flames built to killing temperature. This meant the condemned suffocated slowly in smoke before the fire reached them, or endured the fire's increasing heat for 20, 30, sometimes 40 minutes before death finally came. The crowd watched. The children watched. The nobility raised glasses of wine and commented on the spectacle from their comfortable seats, and the inquisitors recorded everything in ledgers that were filed and preserved with the same meticulous care they applied to their financial accounts. The expense records survived too. How much the wood cost, how much the rope cost to bind the condemned to the stake, how much the executioner was paid. The Inquisition treated the burning of human beings as a line item in a budget complete with receipts. The psychology of systematic torture. Modern psychology has a term for what the Spanish Inquisition created. It is called learned helplessness, and it describes a state in which a person who has been subjected to repeated, inescapable suffering eventually stops trying to resist or escape, even when resistance or escape becomes possible. The entire architecture of Inquisition torture, from the San Benito to the auto da fe, was designed to produce exactly this psychological state. Each method built on the one before it. Each escalation taught the prisoner that resistance was futile, that the pain would only increase, that the only way to make it stop was to surrender completely. The heretic's fork taught them they could not sleep. The strappado taught them their body could be destroyed. The rack taught them the destruction could be taken further than they imagined. The toca taught them they could experience death without dying. And the Spanish donkey taught them there was always something worse. By the time a prisoner reached the final stages of the Inquisition's process, their psychological resistance had been systematically dismantled layer by layer, method by method, until confession was not a choice, but a reflex. The confession was not even necessarily true. The Inquisition knew this. The records contain cases where prisoners confessed to things that were physically impossible, confessed to attending secret ceremonies in cities they had never visited, confessed to practicing rites they had never learned. The Inquisition accepted these confessions anyway, because the confession itself was the point. The truth was irrelevant. Control was everything. The bureaucracy of cruelty. Now let me tell you something about these 8 methods that makes the Spanish Inquisition different from random acts of medieval cruelty. These were not the products of individual sadism. They were bureaucratized. They were regulated. They had rules. The Inquisition published guidelines specifying how torture should be administered. A physician was required to be present to ensure the prisoner did not die, not out of mercy, but because a dead prisoner could not confess. The duration of each session was supposed to be limited to 1 hour, though this rule was routinely circumvented by suspending the session and resuming it the next day, technically making it a new session. Inquisitors were required to approve each escalation and method. A notary recorded the proceedings, documenting the questions asked, the methods applied, and the prisoners' responses, including their screams and pleas for mercy, which were transcribed verbatim into the official record. These documents survive, thousands of them filed in archives in Seville and Madrid and Simancas, written in careful script by men who watched other men and women destroyed, and recorded the details with the precision of accountants. This is what makes the Inquisition's method so disturbing even by the standards of their era. It was not chaos. It was not the frenzy of a mob. It was organized, systematic, professional. conducted by educated men who believed they were saving souls, who went home to their families after a day of operating the rack and ate dinner and slept soundly, who discussed the relative effectiveness of the toca versus the garrucha, the way modern professionals might compare software tools. The bureaucratization of cruelty is what makes the Spanish Inquisition a warning that resonates across 5 centuries, because it demonstrates that the worst horrors are not committed by monsters. They are committed by institutions, staffed by ordinary men, who have been given permission to do extraordinary evil, and who perform that evil with the calm efficiency of people doing their jobs. The scale of suffering. The Spanish Inquisition operated for 356 years from 1478 until 1834. In that time, historians estimate that approximately 150,000 people were charged and roughly 3,000 to 5,000 were executed. Those numbers may seem small compared to other historical atrocities, but they do not capture the true scale of suffering because they do not count the people who were tortured and released, the people who confessed and were sentenced to lesser punishments, the families destroyed, the communities shattered, the entire populations who lived for 3.5 centuries under the knowledge that a neighbor's whisper about their Friday night candles could send them underground to a room that smelled of wet stone and old blood, where men in leather aprons waited beside machines that were built for one purpose only. What do you think was the worst of the 8 methods I described? Which one would have broken you? Drop your thoughts in the comments because here at Crimson Legacy Historians, I read every single one. If this video disturbed you, that means you understand why these stories need to be told. Subscribe to Crimson Legacy Historians and hit that notification bell so you do not miss future videos about the machinery of cruelty that powerful institutions have used throughout history to control what people think and believe. Share this with anyone who thinks the Inquisition is just a punchline from a comedy sketch. These methods did not vanish in 1834. The rack became the stress position, the toca became the waterboard, the heretic's fork became sleep deprivation, the San Benito became the perp walk. The names change, the bureaucracy changes, the permission structure changes. But the fundamental principle that institutions will systematically destroy human bodies to control human minds, that principle has not changed in 500 years. The instruments are gathering dust in museums across Spain, but the ideas behind them are not in museums. They are in policy documents and interrogation manuals and classified memos and every other place where powerful people decide how much pain is acceptable to inflict on someone who believes the wrong thing. Diego's fate. Remember that corridor? Remember the smell of wet stone? Remember Diego Alvarez, 34 years old, a merchant with 2 daughters, walking toward a door behind which 8 methods waited in ascending order of horror, each one worse than the last. Each one designed by educated men who believed they were doing God's work. His wife Isabel waited for him that evening. She cooked dinner and set his place at the table and watched the door. The door did not open. She waited the next day and the next. By the time she learned what had happened to her husband, her house had been seized, her belongings confiscated, her children's inheritance given to the Holy Office. The Inquisition did not only destroy the accused, it destroyed everything and everyone connected to them. That was the design. That was the point. Fear does not work unless it reaches beyond the individual and into the family, the neighborhood, the entire community. The Inquisition understood that the most effective form of control is the kind where people police themselves, where neighbors report neighbors, where everyone watches everyone else because the alternative is the corridor and the chamber and the 8 methods waiting in the dark. Nobody expected the Spanish Inquisition, and nobody who experienced it ever forgot. This has been Crimson Legacy Historians. Remember to subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us next time as we continue to uncover the darkest chapters of human history.